Okay, today we're in Acts chapter 17, and Paul is still on his second missionary journey. It says in verse 1, Paul and Silas traveled through some other towns and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. So let's go back to our map here, and we left them in Philippi, and now they're going to head right down here to Thessalonica, this town right here. And by the way, pay attention to that name, because in just a couple of days, we're going to read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which were letters that Paul wrote back to this church, but this is the first time we read about him visiting that church. Now, back to the text, you can read about that visit for yourself right here, but it says in verse 4, some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. So we see the gospel is starting to spread, but as you read a little bit on your own, you're going to find out that it was a problem and it created issues in that city, and they end up leaving that city for Berea. Okay, and so in verse 10 it says that very night the believers sent Paul and Silas to Berea. When they arrived there, they went once again to the Jewish synagogue. So again, we see Paul and Silas teaching in the Jewish synagogues. They're trying to bring the gospel to the Jewish people. And it says the people of Berea were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica, and they listened eagerly to Paul's message. And look at what it says here. They searched the scriptures day after day to see if what Paul and Silas were saying was true. And what that meant was they were digging into the Old Testament, and they were seeing if what they were teaching from the Old Testament was lining up with everything that Paul was teaching about Jesus. And when they realized that it did line up, many Jews believed, and again, many more people became followers of Jesus there in Berea. But then as you read on, you're going to see some of the Jews from Thessalonica sort of followed him down to Berea and just, again, kept causing trouble for them. So then they end up going to Athens. Okay, let's go back to the map one more time. So here they are in Berea, and they're going to end up traveling southward, and they're going to end up all the way down here in Athens. So back to the text, it says, while Paul was waiting for his companions in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. Because, Athens was a pretty big metropolis, and it was very, very pagan. So he went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. And he also spoke daily in the public square to all who happened to be there. So we notice these two things. He's speaking to, sort of God-fearing people in the synagogues, but he's also speaking to the pagans out in the public square. Now, as you read further, you're going to see that he ends up debating even more. And it says in verse 22, so Paul stood before the council and he addressed them as follows. And so this is him out in the public square, sort of talking among the philosophers, talking almost like a philosopher. He said, men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines. And one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God, Paul said, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm telling you about. Now, I'll let you read that for yourself, but I just wanted to point out that we have Paul here being very missiological. In other words, Paul is now speaking to a bunch of pagans, and he's not talking about David and Abraham and stuff that the Jews would have understood. He's trying to contextualize it for the Gentiles. He's trying to speak in their language. He's trying to sort of articulate it in a way where they could receive it. And that's really helpful for us today, because if you're a follower of Jesus, this is sometimes what you need to do in your world, is you need to speak the truth in love. You need to speak the truth in a way that someone can understand it. You can't just use, Christianese if they're not Christians, right? And Paul gives us a great early example of this in Acts chapter 17. So anyway, you're ready to read Acts 17, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 18.